All right, today we're going to tackle one of the biggest, most fundamental ideas in all of modern economics. We're diving into a text that makes a pretty shocking argument that interest isn't a tool for growth, but a weapon of economic destruction.
And that's really the core question, isn't it? Our entire global financial system is built on the assumption that interest is this necessary engine for progress. But what if that's not true? What if it's actually causing way more harm than good?
So the text we're exploring today doesn't pull any punches. It flat out calls interest a weapon. In this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly why it comes to that conclusion, step by step.
So where does this all begin? What's really interesting is that the first line of attack isn't about economics at all, it's about ethics. The source argues that the very act of charging interest has this corrosive effect on our character.
Yeah, just look at this contrast right here. The source is saying that a mindset based on interest systematically chips away at our better nature. Instead of seeing someone in need and thinking, how can I help? It makes you think, how can I profit? It's the total opposite of charity, which is all about sacrifice and community.
And the language here is, wow, it's incredibly strong. This quote really gets to the heart of the moral argument. The idea is that the cold, hard math of interest just hardens the heart, turning a lender into this financial beast who doesn't care one bit about the suffering of the borrower.
Okay, so let's see how this idea expands. The author argues that this moral decay doesn't just stay with one person. It starts to tear apart the very fabric of society itself.
And the argument is that this happens in two major ways. First, inside a country, it creates this constant state of conflict. You have the lenders, who get richer without actually working, and the borrowers who work their lives away just to pay off debt. The text says this is a recipe for resentment and unrest. And that exact same dynamic plays out on the global stage too.
This chart really helps visualize that global divide. The source points to agreements like the Bretton Woods system, arguing they basically locked in a power imbalance. Powerful creditor nations got to call the shots for debtor nations, essentially stripping them of their independence and creating a ton of bitterness. I mean, you can see the gap becomes absolutely huge.
All right, now we get to the real meat of the critique. The economic devastation that the source claims is caused by interest. This is the most detailed part of the whole argument, so let's break it down.
The text slices up the economic damage into three main types of loans. We're going to look at each one: personal loans for just getting by, business loans for commerce, and government loans for public projects. So, starting with personal loans. The logic here is that when the poorest people have to spend their money paying interest, that money is literally sucked out of the real economy. They have less cash to buy things, which means less demand, which hurts businesses and ultimately leads to economic stagnation. Next up, business loans. To get this point, we need to understand what the source means by a trade cycle. It's not seen as some natural, healthy part of capitalism. No, it's viewed as a completely artificial, destructive boom-and-bust cycle caused directly by fiddling with interest rates.
So here's the supposed mechanism, this four-step process. It starts with low interest rates, which gets businesses borrowing and expanding like crazy. But then, as the economy heats up, lenders jack up the rates to make a bigger profit. This puts a massive squeeze on businesses. Suddenly their costs go through the roof. They can't afford their loans, and boom, widespread collapse, shuttered factories, mass unemployment, a full-blown crisis.
And there's another nasty twist to this. The source talks about something called capital strikes. This is when capitalists decide that interest rates aren't high enough to be worth their while, so they just stop lending. They hoard their cash. This starves the rest of the economy of the capital it needs to function, basically holding everyone hostage until they get the higher returns they want.
And finally, let's touch on government loans. The text argues this is a double whammy. If a government borrows from its own wealthy citizens, it ends up taxing everybody else to pay interest to that small, wealthy group. And if it borrows from another country, well, we've already seen how that goes. It slowly signs away its independence, letting the lender nation dictate its policies.
So, after walking us through the moral, social, and economic arguments, the source brings everything together to deliver its final and pretty damning verdict on the role of interest.
The conclusion is totally unambiguous. The text flat out asserts that interest is a destructive force, period. It argues that it dams up the natural flow of wealth, that it directly causes unemployment by creating an artificial shortage of capital, and that ultimately it builds a system where the rich get richer without doing any productive work while everybody else bears all the risk.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. We've just explored a perspective that points to interest as the root cause of moral, social, and economic instability. Now, that view is in complete opposition to most mainstream economic thinking. So the question to leave you with is this: how does hearing this perspective challenge the way you think about the very foundations of our economic world?